Sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest histories, and sometimes a single gesture, a hand resting too long on a flower, a breath taken too sharply beside a memorial, can awaken truths no one sees coming. Before I tell you what happened the morning the helicopter came down on the Navy parade field, I want you to understand one thing. Mysteries don't always announce themselves with shadows. Sometimes they arrive wearing grief and holding roses. And if you believe stories about respect, sacrifice, and the danger of judging someone too quickly matter now more than ever, make sure to like and subscribe, because what happened next is something every one of us should hear. Alara Cole walked through the front gate of Falcon Ridge Naval Base with the kind of presence that made people glance twice without knowing why. She had that quiet, almost weightless way of moving, the way someone does when the world has taught them to walk softly, but stay sharp. 28 years old, barely older than some of the recruits jogging past her, she looked like any other young widow visiting a husband's memorial on a cool, overcast morning. A simple black dress, hair in a low knot, a bouquet of white lilies held close to her chest, the kind of sight people witness, feel a pang of sympathy for, and then gently look away from. I stood far enough to watch her approach the marble wall without drawing attention, but close enough to see the heaviness in her shoulders, the kind carried by someone who has rehearsed the same moment in their mind 100 times before stepping into it. The memorial grounds were roped off that day because a VIP tour for congressional observers was scheduled to begin at noon, and the Navy liked its order. Clean lines, controlled movement, no surprises. So when Alara slipped past the small orange cone and onto the path reserved for official participants, the young petty officer guarding the area reacted with rigid textbook confidence, the kind that smells more like nervousness than authority. "Ma'am, this section is closed," he said, stepping in front of her with a stiff hand raised. He looked barely 22, jaw tight, uniform so sharply pressed it could have cut paper. Alara paused, offered him a quiet nod, and tried to sidestep, clearly not wanting trouble, clearly just wanting a private moment at the wall, but the petty officer moved with her, blocking her again. "I'm going to need to see your authorization to be here," he pressed, louder this time, loud enough for nearby families to turn. For a moment, Alara simply stood still, not fearful or confrontational, but tired in a way that reached into her bones and made her inhale, as if reminding herself to behave gently. "I'm here for Lieutenant Mason Cole," she said softly, her voice steady as still water. "This visit won't take long." The petty officer blinked at the name. "We have dozens of LTs honored here, ma'am. You can pay respects from the public area." His tone wasn't cruel, just young and convinced protocol mattered more than pain. Alara bowed her head slightly, as if absorbing another bruise to the heart, then attempted a final time to step around him. This time he escalated, motioning to a second sailor across the grass. "I need backup at the memorial perimeter," he called, misreading her calm as noncompliance. It was the kind of moment where the air seems to hold its breath, the kind where people nearby slow down just enough to watch, unsure whether they're witnessing a misunderstanding or the beginning of something unfortunate. Alara tightened her fingers around the lilies. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "Please don't do this today." But authority without wisdom is a volatile thing. The petty officer stepped closer, lowering his voice into something sterner, something he believed sounded professional. "Ma'am, if you continue toward that wall, I will have to detain you for ignoring a lawful instruction on federal property." His hand reached toward her elbow, not yet touching, but close enough to rattle anyone else. Alara didn't flinch. She merely shifted to keep the flowers from being crushed. Her sleeve slid back half an inch from the movement, revealing a thin tattoo along her inner forearm, a trident wrapped around a coded grid pattern. The petty officer squinted at it. "Is that some kind of knockoff Navy design?" he asked, half scoffing, half suspicious. "You know wearing unauthorized insignia is a federal offense, right?" The irony tasted bitter even from where I stood. If he'd known what he was looking at, if he'd recognized the symbol that only a select handful of naval special warfare officers were ever invited, even allowed, to bear, he would have backed down so quickly his shoes might have squealed. But he didn't know. To him, she wasn't a former mission commander. She was just a young woman in a black dress who seemed out of place. A soft target for a rigid rulebook. When the backup second sailor arrived and the petty officer announced he was calling security forces to escort her off the grounds, several families stopped walking entirely. Some whispered, "Why is she resisting? Is she even allowed here?" Younger women sometimes make claims. They didn't say it cruelly. They said it with the casual ignorance that slips out when people think they understand a situation they actually know nothing about. Alara stood perfectly still, staring at the memorial wall just 20 paces away, as if those 20 paces were the longest distance in the world. She whispered the words I later learned she whispered every time she visited. "I'm sorry, Mason. I'm trying." And then the air changed. Not gradually, violently. A deep metallic thrum rolled across the parade field, shaking the clipped grass and rattling the flagpoles. People instinctively looked skyward. The petty officer's hand froze on his radio. The second sailor stepped back. Shadows swept across the memorial grounds as a black, unmarked helicopter descended from the low clouds, angling straight toward the restricted zone. Soldiers, families, officers, they all backed away in confusion, shielding their faces from the gusting rotor wash. Alara did not move. She stood rooted, lilies trembling in her grip, her expression unreadable, not frightened, not surprised, just bracing. The petty officer shouted something drowned out by the roar, but it didn't matter. Because within seconds, the helicopter touched down on the grass with a forceful thud, and 6 figures in tactical gear stepped out in synchronized formation. The kind of formation you only see from people who've bled together. People who don't arrive somewhere, they take the ground beneath them, and every single one of them had their eyes locked on her. That was the moment, the unforgettable breath before truth crashes through pretense. When I realized, the widow placing lilies at the wall wasn't just mourning a hero. She was one. Dust spiraled around the memorial grounds as the helicopter's rotors slowed, sending ripples across the lily petals still clenched in Alara's hand, and the petty officer, who seconds earlier had threatened to detain her, stood frozen with his mouth half open, all authority stripped from him by the sheer gravity of what was unfolding. The 6 figures approaching were unmistakably SEALs, but not the polished, ceremonial kind used for public events. These men moved with the heavy, grounded confidence of operators who hadn't yet unlearned the battlefield, their boots thudding in perfect unison, their faces shadowed by scars, beards, and the kind of silence that comes from seeing too much. Families instinctively stepped aside, creating an aisle without being told, as though everyone sensed they were witnessing something sacred or dangerous or both. The petty officer attempted to straighten his posture, tried to gesture for them to stop, but the SEAL at the front, a towering man with a shaved head and a jagged scar that carved down his cheek, didn't even acknowledge him. His eyes were locked entirely on Alara, who stood quietly by the wall, almost small in her black dress, but somehow unmovable, like the center of gravity had shifted and everything now orbited her. When the lead operator reached her, he stopped with the precision of a parade ground maneuver and, in full view of everyone, snapped into a rigid salute so sharp it cracked the air like a whip. "Commander Cole," he said, voice like gravel dragged across steel, and you could hear the grief in it, the reverence, the kind of respect that isn't taught but earned through fire. "The team stands ready." The world went still. A ripple of gasps moved through the watching families and sailors like a wave. "Commander? That girl? That widow?" The petty officer's face drained of blood so fast he seemed to pale in real time. The second sailor beside him muttered something that sounded like a prayer or a curse. Even I felt my heartbeat climb into my throat as the reality settled over the scene like a weighted blanket pinned by truth. She wasn't some lost visitor. She was their commanding officer. And not just any officer. These men were part of an elite unit known for answering to no one but the Navy's top brass. Yet here they were, standing like statues made of muscle and reverence, waiting for a signal from a woman the petty officer had just tried to remove from the grounds. Alara didn't immediately speak. She simply stared at them, and for a moment something unguarded flickered across her face. Grief, shock, perhaps even anger that they had come for her publicly instead of quietly. But then she exhaled, and the emotion melted into that calm, composed stillness I'd come to recognize as her quiet armor. "Master Chief Rourke," she said softly, and his eyes, hard as cut stone, glimmered with something almost like relief at hearing her voice. I didn't expect all of you. The team behind him adjusted slightly, their formation tightening in an instinctive gesture of unity. You told us today would be difficult, Rourke replied. We weren't about to let you stand alone. The petty officer stumbled forward, hands shaking, trying to salvage whatever scraps of authority he could grasp. Sirs, Master Chief, I didn't know who she. I didn't. But Rourke turned his head slowly, and the look he gave the young sailor silenced him harder than a punch. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. The kind that crushes harder than fury. The kind delivered by a man who had buried friends and seen leaders rise and fail and bleed beside him. Son, Rourke said, voice low but powerful enough to rattle ribs. You don't talk to a commanding officer like that. Not on my watch. Not on any watch. The petty officer seemed to shrink by inches, his spine bending into apology even as his lips failed to produce coherent words. Alara reached out, placing a gentle hand on Rourke's forearm. That's enough, she murmured. There was no sharpness, no scolding, just calm authority. He followed procedure. She turned to the petty officer, offering a nod that held both forgiveness and an unspoken lesson. Protocol matters. Assumptions do more harm. The petty officer swallowed hard, eyes wet, and nodded rapidly, relief and humiliation mixing across his face. Meanwhile, the SEALs, as if synchronized to her breath, removed their helmets and tucked them beneath their arms. Their faces were solemn, carved with pain that hadn't faded since the day they lost Mason Cole, Alara's husband, their teammate, and the man who had died on a mission under her command. They formed a semicircle around her as she stepped forward to the wall, the lilies trembling slightly in her grip. She knelt, quiet, slow, deliberate, and placed the flowers beneath Mason's name, her fingers lingering on the etched letters as though they could warm under her touch. The operators bowed their heads with her. Families around the field mirrored them instinctively, a wave of reverence rippling outward. Even the petty officer lowered his gaze, tears slipping from the corner of his eye. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed loudly. The wind itself seemed to hush, carrying only the soft flutter of flag fabric overhead. Then Rourke stepped forward again, holding a small, square metal case, weathered, scratched, clearly carried across continents. He extended it toward her with both hands, like an offering to royalty. We found this, he said quietly. Recovered during the investigation. It was meant for you. Alara hesitated before accepting it, her fingers trembling for the first time since I'd seen her arrive. When she clicked open the lid, a single steel plaque rested inside, engraved with words that looked like they'd been carved by someone who wanted them preserved forever. Her breath hitched when she read it. Rourke swallowed, voice thick. His last recording, he said, barely audible. He wanted you to know he followed you because he trusted you, because he believed in you. Alara closed the case slowly, pressing it to her chest. And when she lifted her head, her eyes were no longer just sad. They were fierce, steady, alive. The kind of eyes that command nations, not units. The kind of eyes that make even battle-hardened SEALs stand straighter. Around us, the air felt charged, like the beginning of a storm or the end of a long drought. Because in that moment, every person present, family, sailor, officer, understood the truth the Navy had never spoken aloud. The young widow with lilies wasn't just the wife of a fallen hero. She was a hero who had led heroes. And the world had forgotten her, until now. The air felt different after Alara rose from Mason's name, as if the entire memorial had shifted around her, bending subtly to acknowledge the gravity she carried, no longer invisible beneath her grief. Even the clouds overhead seemed to hesitate, drifting slower, their shadows stretching across the parade field like a curtain being pulled back on a long-concealed truth. When she turned to the petty officer, who stood stiff as a post, face blotched with humiliation and dawning understanding, she didn't look at him with triumph or resentment, only a calm, measured empathy that came from knowing what it felt like to underestimate and be underestimated, to be discounted and to misjudge. You were doing your duty, she told him softly, and though the words could have sounded like a dismissal, they struck him with the force of absolution. But remember this, rank isn't always worn where you can see it. The petty officer swallowed hard, his breath hitching, and nodded rapidly, as if trying to absorb every lesson the moment etched into him. Behind him, the second sailor straightened, his expression shifting from confusion to reverence, and other families began whispering her name like a legend they had heard once but forgotten. Commander Alara Cole, the mission leader who had slipped into silence after the death of her husband, her file sealed, her story locked behind clearance levels that most people would never touch. Officers rushed across the field now, pulled from surrounding buildings by the sight of the unplanned landing, and when Captain Alden stepped into view, the base's commanding officer, a man known for formality and strict standards, he didn't ask questions. He simply stopped, squared his shoulders, and offered Alara the kind of salute you see only in farewell videos and historic reenactments. Slow, deliberate, deeply personal. "Commander Cole," he said, loud enough for every witness to hear. "This base apologizes for failing to anticipate your visit. We are honored to have you home." His voice wavered slightly at the final word, home, and something in Alara's jaw tightened. Not pain, not weakness, but the weight of knowing that home was now an echo of a life she once had and could never return to. The SEALs closed ranks behind her, each one standing with the rigid discipline reserved for funerals and final send-offs. And Rourke stepped forward with a small velvet pouch in his hand. "We have one more thing," he said, his deep voice gentler than before. He handed her the pouch, and inside was a single challenge coin, hers, battered around the edges, scarred by fire, dirt, seawater, and time. "We found it on the last recon sweep," he continued. "Couldn't leave it there." Alara stared at it, her breath catching, and for a long moment the world felt suspended, as though everything was waiting for her reaction. She pressed the coin to her palm, then her forehead, closing her eyes as though reconnecting with a piece of herself she'd buried beneath grief. When she opened her eyes again, they glistened, not from sorrow alone, but from something rekindled, something fierce and indomitable. "Thank you," she whispered, and every SEAL in the semicircle seemed to exhale for the first time since arriving, as if they had been holding their breath until she accepted the final piece of her past. The petty officer, trembling, approached her hesitantly. "Commander," he began, voice barely audible. I didn't know. I didn't mean." She placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. "One day," she told him gently, "you'll meet someone whose story you don't understand yet. Give them the benefit of possibility, not suspicion." It wasn't a reprimand. It was a gift, a principle shaped by sacrifices she would never brag about. Tears slid down his cheeks, and he saluted her, shakily, earnestly, from a place of genuine respect rather than forced protocol. She returned the salute, small but precise, and the gesture transformed him. He straightened, shoulders squaring, as though he had grown into his uniform in that instant. Family stepped closer now, not intruding, but drawn by the gravity of what they'd witnessed, and I could hear someone whisper, voice trembling, "She led those men at 28? Another answered, "She saved them. Look at the way they stand with her." Captain Alden nodded once at Rourke, granting quiet permission, and Rourke signaled the team. In perfect synchronization, the SEALs shifted formation, creating a wide corridor leading from the memorial wall to the helicopter, an honor walkway rarely seen outside covert ceremonies and classified send-offs. Alara hesitated at the threshold of the formation, glancing back at Mason's engraved name one last time. The lilies she had placed trembled from the settling breeze, and she whispered something silently, words only the wind would ever hear. Then she stepped forward, and as she walked between her husband's brothers in arms, each SEAL lifted his hand in slow, solemn salute. It was a tribute normally reserved for fallen officers, but today it was meant for one who still lived, one who carried the weight of command and loss in equal measure. With every step she took, the petty officer, the families, the officers, even strangers passing through the base, all straightened, as though witnessing a story they would recount for years. When she reached the helicopter, Rourke opened the door for her with a reverence that said everything words couldn't. She paused, turning to look back at the memorial one final time, then at the petty officer, offering him a nod that said forgiveness, understanding, and growth could coexist. He saluted again, this time with clean, sharp precision. The rotors roared to life, sending grass and petals swirling into the air, and as the helicopter lifted off, every person below held their salute, watching her rise. And just before the aircraft disappeared into the cloud bank, I realized something with absolute clarity. Today wasn't just about remembering Mason Cole. It was about remembering who Alara Cole had been, who she still was, and who the world had almost forgotten. A commander, a leader, a soldier forged by fire. The quiet woman with lilies, revealed at last not as a widow defined by loss, but as a warrior reborn in the open sky.